I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the new Mitsubishi Outlander. It's been a long time coming for the new Outlander. The previous generation did service across almost the entire 2010s here in Australia, and little did we know when the last one launched, it was going to become one of the final Mitsubishi products that the brand was fully in charge of itself, because in the intervening period, Mitsubishi has been bought out by Nissan. And underneath the new Outlander sits the same CMF CD platform of the next generation Nissan X-Trail. So this car isn't just an Outlander, it's also a bit of a preview of what the next X-Trail is going to be like too. So there's so much that's new about this car, and you've got to start with the styling, because the previous one, to my eyes at least, just looked like an appliance. There was nothing really interesting about the design. You definitely couldn't say that about the new 2022 Outlander. It looks great. This one in deep blue looks really expensive. In combination with the big 20-inch wheels, this radical front end, and the really handsome rear end, it's a good looking vehicle. And it looks much more expensive than its price. The one I've brought along is an upper mid-spec Aspire two-wheel drive that's just over 41 grand before on-road costs. Not particularly expensive for a 7-seat SUV. In today's video, we're going to be checking out the interior of the new Outlander, which is really different to the old one. We'll have a look in the back seats and the boot, we'll discuss the running costs, and then we'll head out onto the road in this 2.5 litre Outlander, which uses a Nissan engine, and we'll see how this SUV drives. But before we get started, make sure to click subscribe down below the video. For me, it's the interior of the new Mitsubishi Outlander that has improved the most. And that's because designing a cool looking exterior, I guess you can put a good looking car over any old chassis, but getting the interior right actually takes skill and money. And you can tell that Mitsubishi and their new owners at Renault Nissan have actually had the resources to do an interior properly. So not only does it look good, but the materials all feel high class. It feels like, 10 to 15 grand more expensive than it used to be, but most grades are only up by about $2,000. And I definitely think that you get value for money compared to the old Outlander, which just felt like a rental car, basically. It was durable, it was well sized for a lot of families, but it didn't really have much flair to the design. You would not accuse the new car of that. It starts with this steering wheel, perforated leather, paddle shifters, and really nice sort of knurled toggle here on the left-hand spoke. Looks good, feels good, and it's not too big, so you don't feel like you're driving a bus. And I think that's one of many things about the Outlander that feels a little bit, a bit sexier than before. There was nothing really sexy about the old one. Now, looking at the infotainment package, we've got a 9-inch touchscreen up here and a 7-inch digital display. And actually, leaving aside Volkswagen, who I think get their digital displays or digital instrument cluster really right, the Mitsubishi one's really good too. So we've got this really good view for the song that you've got playing on Apple CarPlay. So you can have Waze or something up here. You can have your media with Albumart right in the display. We've got a kind of redundant safety one because it's just massive. We've got a home screen. We've got a big, clear trip computer, and we've got a compass. But what we can't do is put a map in this screen, which would be even cooler. I quite like how the tacho and the speedometer they cycle. I can't think of what might look like a Rolodex or something, but I'm a little bit too young to say that conclusively. Either way though, it feels really techy and cool and clear. As for this screen over here, it has wireless Apple CarPlay, which is just great and still really unusual for this segment, although Android Auto does require a cable through either the new USB-C port or the old style USB port here in the center console, plus there's wireless phone charging. And while only the higher spec Exceed and Exceed Tourer get a Bose stereo, even the standard speakers on this Aspire actually sound pretty good. So while you're here kind of enjoying the tech, you've got your wireless CarPlay going, you've got your wireless charging, your music sounds good too. And then there's the seats, which I really like. They've got a classic Mitsubishi design, which is this sort of double pin striping that runs laterally across the seats. The bolsters are pretty fat. The electric adjustment for the drive is decent. And we've got power lumbar over here too. So you feel comfortable. It's easy to see out of. And then all these secondary materials are soft too. So massive step up in perceived quality for the new Outlander. Problems in here, Well, to be honest with you, they're pretty few and far between. There's a fair bit of piano black down here, which is going to mark up. Some of these soft materials up here also mark a little bit more than we might expect in some other cars. But, you know, maybe a little bit more oddment storage around the center console would have been good. We've got 2 cup holders here. We've got a little central box. And the door bins can fit a large water bottle. So for just over 41 grand as tested, this feels pretty nice up front. Jumping into the Mitsubishi Outlander's second row, and you'll see that it's nice and spacious, even for adults. So for myself at 6 foot, I've got loads of headroom. This car doesn't have a sunroof, but even on variants with a sunroof, I think it'll be completely fine in terms of rear headroom. Legroom, I've got enough, and tow room, I've got heaps of that. Now, one interesting thing is that because this is based on the Renault-Nissan CMF CD platform shared with a whole bunch of non-SUVs, the floor is a little bit higher than you'd normally expect. And as such, I feel like I'm sort of floating a little bit above the seat base. I'm actually not. I actually do have reasonable support. It's just you feel quite a bit higher than you would normally, but at least that means you've got a good view out, stadium style seating above the front seats, which is another thing that helps stave off car sickness. Now, in terms of amenities back here, we've got air vents, little cubby, another 2 USB ports, one old style and one USB-C. We have here the full flip down armrest here with a couple of cup holders. That's interesting. And then over here on the door, we actually do have this generous sort of pleather pad helping to break up the hard plastics, which is nice. And then on the back of the seats, not only do both of them have a map pocket, but they've also got supplementary pockets like a Volkswagen Tiguan, except the quality of the ones on the Mitsubishi actually feels better than the ones on the Volkswagen, despite being relatively inexpensive. So that's good. It's big, it's spacious, it's easy to see out of, and it's got pretty much all the features you'd be looking for. Here around the back, the treatment of the new Outlander is definitely a little less heavy-handed, I would say, than the previous generation of this car, which had those big tail lights. They're still quite wide, but they're definitely tightened up, and just visually there's less weight going on here. Now we've got our Aspire badging, new model for the Outlander, sits just underneath the Exceed, and then above the Exceed there's the Exceed Tourer as well. Anyway, here on the mid-spec car, we still have a power tailgate, which is great, and actually not that common for this segment. And that opens up to reveal a boot that's pretty big. You can see that we've got our 3 suitcases in here, no problem, with one of the second row seats in place. If I take our suitcases out, we can have a look at the packaging of the third row. So as I mentioned, I've already got one seat set up. It's pretty easy to pull up the next seat, which can also recline some way. Where's our headrest? Well, unlike some, it's not clever enough to have been packaged with the headrests folding away. So instead they have their own little cubby where this metal definitely won't rattle against anything. Anyway, drop that in here. We've got our headrests. Still got enough space for a couple of school bags or something here in the back, no worries. Underneath here, as I mentioned, we do have that cubby space, and beneath that we have a space saver spare as well. Controls here to close the boot or close it and lock the car, meaning we can move on to running costs. So what's it going to cost you to run a new Mitsubishi Outlander? Well, until the plug-in hybrid arrives, there's just the one engine, a 2.5 litre petrol 4-cylinder, which in our testing used 8 litres per 100 Ks, which is fine for this segment, particularly for a non-hybrid. Of course, something like a RAV4 hybrid is going to use a lot less, but good luck getting your hands on one of those in the next 9 or 10 months. Now, servicing this vehicle is really inexpensive to service for the first 5 years. Each of those visits, over 15,000 Ks a piece, will cost you $199 for a 5-year, 75,000 K total of $995. Very cheap. But the next 5 services after that get much more expensive. So the 10-year servicing cost for this car is just over $3,100. Still reasonable for a vehicle, just signposting that it's actually services 6 to 10 that cost the most in this car. Now, speaking of 10 years, the Outlander has a 10-year warranty, 10-year, 200,000 Ks. So not massively generous on distance across 10 years, but certainly good peace of mind when average for the industry is 5 years. And lastly, insurance. In the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer spent $892 to comprehensively insure a new Mitsubishi Outlander. everybody's situation will vary and your premium will vary based on things insurers take into account, like where you live, who drives the car, their driving history, etc. So what is Mitsubishi's brand new Outlander like to drive? Well, I've brought it out here to some good driving roads west of Sydney, and we'll basically be able to see what's what, because these roads really give an opportunity for a well-sorted vehicle to shine. They show us what ride quality is really like, what body control is really like, and whether or not an engine is up to scratch for country conditions here in Australia. Now, I've already done a fair bit of suburban driving in the car, so it's really going to be this route that kind of brings out where it sits in the pecking order of mid-size, upper mid-size SUVs. So the big change is that under the skin, the Outlander is no longer a Mitsubishi, really. I mean, it's badged to Mitsubishi, and you can tell Mitsubishi have had quite a lot of input into the product planning because the interior doesn't really look like a Nissan. The seats are certainly not out of a Nissan, and the styling outside is all Mitsubishi and quite cool. But under the skin, we've got Nissan's CMF CD platform here, so C and D segment platform, with those European designations, but basically this is the platform that underpins the next Nissan X-Trail. So it's had a pretty comprehensive going over CMF CD, and the forthcoming X-Trail is expected to be an improvement over the outgoing version, but the Mitsubishi Outlander actually gives us an early preview of what the X-Trail will be like. So what is it like? Well, first of all, let's start with the engine. There's just one engine at the moment available on this Mitsubishi in Australia, and it's a 2.5 litre naturally aspirated petrol 4-cylinder, again sourced from Nissan. It makes 135 kilowatts of power, 245 newton meters of torque. Now there's no turbocharging on this engine, but because it's already relatively high displacement, like a Mazda CX-5 2.5 or something like that, it doesn't feel completely underdone. It's certainly way off the pace of a Ford Escape with its 183 kilowatt 2 litre turbo, or a Mazda CX-5 turbo, or a Volkswagen Tiguan 162 TSI. This sort of runs with cars like the atmospheric CX-5 or the Toyota RAV4 2.5. And that's fine, because it does have enough get up and go. It's got a decent slab of torque. You just have to rev the car a little bit more than you would a turbocharged rival in order to get at that torque. But that leads me to sort of one dynamic flaw with the powertrain, and that's the CVT. Most of the time it's very well behaved. It's one of the better CVTs we've tested, but when you need to get the best out of the engine, I'll give it a good rev here and you'll see what I mean. You know, we just shoot for the sky. There aren't really simulated ratios in the Outlander. And the interesting thing is where the shift points are for every sort of throttle application, apart from if you're at absolute full throttle. So if you're getting into it, it's going to upshift at 4,800 revs, which is really low for a naturally aspirated petrol. It's only if you're completely into the pedal to the metal, then it'll go past 5,000 revs, but it's still not a particularly high revving engine. It's entirely sort of pragmatic and functional. It gets the job done. And, you know, in our testing, it returned about 8 litres per 100 Ks combined, which is pretty good. Now, the Outlander plug-in hybrid has always been the interesting Outlander. There is going to be another generation of plug-in hybrid. That was one of the big things that Nissan got out of the deal when they bought Mitsubishi a few years back. Mitsubishi's plug-in hybrid tech is pretty good. The Eclipse Cross plug-in hybrid we tested recently did bang on its WLTP range, so they really do deliver what they say on the tin, and we're expecting big things for the next Outlander plug-in hybrid, which should give this car that really nice, plentiful low-end torque from the electric motor when they're working in combination, but also should allow you to drive, you know, maybe 40 to 50 Ks on electric power alone, and that would be great. Perfect for people's commutes, the school run, etc. So the engine situation is fine. There's a plug-in hybrid on the horizon, and the sole gearbox, as I mentioned already, is that CVT down here. Now, it's not technically a CVT on the plug-in hybrid, but here on the petrol, it most certainly is. But what about the Outlander's other characteristics? Firstly, it's very easy to see out of. This car's got a great glass house. The rear window behind me is nice and big. The mirrors are big. Less and less do we see these kind of elephant mirrors, as I call them, because a lot of the time for aero and for styling, designers want to go for a smaller mirror. Not this car. It's got nice big mirrors, and that means you can see out of it really well. The seat is comfortable, the steering wheel feels good, and the technology package is actually quite well done, really. It all works well, it's all quite intuitive. So far so good for the Outlander. The issues with this car start to crop up when it comes to the ride. And that's because, while I love the fact that Mitsubishi have shown some real flair in terms of design for the exterior of this car, I mean, it looks cool, really cool, genuinely. And those 20-inch wheels are a part of that, but unfortunately, they really harm this car's ride quality. Now, the old Outlander didn't ride very well either, but it didn't ride well for reasons of suspension tuning. This time around, the suspension tune is much better. Still not up there with a Skoda Kodiaq or a Kia Sorento or a Hyundai Santa Fe, but the suspension tune is much, much better. It's simply that there is a lot of wheel and not a lot of sidewall, and those big 20-inch wheels weigh a lot, and they just don't have enough rubber in this car to prevent those wheels from crashing into bumps and potholes. And in order to contain that, the actual suspension tune itself has to be relatively stiff, which kind of doesn't really suit the fairly sort of soothing and relaxed demeanor of this car. And right now I'm on a really nice, smooth, high-speed back road out here in the Blue Mountains, and this road has recently been resealed and I've got absolutely no problem. In fact, the stiffness, the firmness of the suspension on a good surface feels really great, really positive, sort of that anti-car sickness vibe, because you can feel the road. The whole thing feels pretty dynamically well sorted. The issues start when you're driving on an Australian road that hasn't been resurfaced recently and actually is that really coarse chip, rougher bitumen that is very common throughout this country. So I'm going to find a bit of road like that and I'll come back to you. Okay, so I'm about to turn off this really glossy, well-finished road. I had some bad fires through here in the last few years, and a lot of the roads have been redone. But this one hasn't. And so you're going to hear it. You're going to hear the intrusion from the road in the next segment. And I'm just going to talk through why it is that the Outlander doesn't ride that well on these 20-inch wheels. Now, a really expensive SUV can have 20s or 21s or 22s and still ride quite well, because there's lots of money left over from that fatty price tag to invest in really high-end springs and dampers. And so you can sort of ameliorate the impact of a low or shallow sidewall and big wheel thumping into things. You can kind of ameliorate that if you have a really good shocks package too. And then of course on real luxury stuff, we've got air suspension. Now, in the Outlander, this is a 41 grand car, the one I'm sitting in right now. It's not expensive. It's affordable. And so there's just not that money left over to do it all with suspension. So you've kind of got one setting and that's it. And the shocks package that's included is just not super sophisticated and high end like you would find on even a Skoda Kodiaq, to be honest, because you're not going to get into a similar Kodiaq for at least another 10 grand. So there's just money there that goes into higher quality suspension items, among other things. You know, expensive cars, more expensive cars aren't just expensive to shake you by the ankles. There is money put into suspension that lets the car have greater bandwidth. Here in the Outlander, fine for commuting and really good for glossy, smooth highways and well-finished back roads, because it has really good turn-in, it's stable, it can maintain speed really well. It's actually quite engaging. But then when you find a worse quality road like this, the stiffness that's there to contain this car's tall body starts working against it, and you just get this very firm, moderately crashy ride. But because there's kind of an underlying springiness as well, there's a disconnect between the super firm suspension and, I wouldn't call it loose body control, but relaxed body control. And so at times it can feel a tiny bit sketchy, actually. You can feel like there's just this rear end float that the car is struggling to contain. It does contain it. It can do it. And the ESC tune is also pretty good. You just don't have that much fun on a back road like this. Something like the Kodiaq, the Mazda CX-8, the Kia Sorento and Hyundai Santa Fe, all of those cars have a better resolved suspension tune. But aside from their top spec variants, in the case of the Sorento, Santa Fe and Kodiaq, they don't run wheels this big. And most of their mid-tier cars that would compete with the Aspire on spec are on like 17s, 18s, maybe 19s, and that just gives them a little bit of extra help in smoothing off those bumps. So I think that's something for Mitsubishi to consider for the midlife update to this car would be, do we need to have 20s across the Aspire, the Exceed and the Exceed Tourer? And if so, where can some resources be thrown back into the suspension tune in order to maintain what's good about the ride of this car, which is that you do have some road feel and it is nice and stable at high speeds, but just reintroducing a little bit of that comfort focus of the previous gen, which didn't have the body control, but it did have the ability to round off the bumps better than this car. Now, what else? Safety systems, a mixed bag. So we do have AEB in this car, we've got adaptive cruise control, we've got lane departure warning, but it just vibrates the steering wheel really. At least that's all it's been doing for me. And you have to turn that on, or you have to turn it off every time you start the car, and it's quite, on a narrow back road like this, it's quite intrusive, but I guess it's meant to be intrusive because, hey, you're touching the center line, you're not supposed to do that. We've got blind spot monitoring as well, that works well. And the reversing camera and 360-degree camera is really good quality, really high resolution. So I think on the whole, we'll be interested to put the Outlander up against some of its rivals just to really pull apart the pluses and the minuses. At present, it feels like it's almost there, you know, but there's still a few rivals that have just struck probably a superior balance of ride and handling that makes them feel a bit better suited to Australian roads. The other wild card, I haven't driven a new Outlander not on 20s. That could be the solution. I look forward to doing that soon. So that's a first look at the new Mitsubishi Outlander. I think we can probably all agree the next thing that has to be done is this vehicle needs to be tested on wheels that don't measure 20 inches in size. Because while they look cool, they don't do great things for the ride quality, which is a shame because so much of the rest of the Outlander is really well resolved. The petrol engine's pretty good, the interior is a massive improvement over the old Outlander, and that styling is really nice. Keen to know your view though, let me know below the video in the comments. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.